So I thought I would start by just doing a very quick introduction to Greek religion. I'm sure a lot of this will be background that you all know, but just to kind of cite and position the kind of stuff I'm going to be talking about within a rather broader context. Of course, as we all know, that a kind of pagan classical religious system is a system which has many, many gods. The most famous, of course, are the Olympian gods. I'm sure you can name many of them. I've written a little list for myself: Zeus, Hera, Apollo, Hades, Poseidon, Ares, Aphrodite, Demeter, Dionysus, Hermes, Hephaestus, Artemis. Those are the 12 I came up with. You can put in the Q&A any you think I've missed. So these are named gods, and as you know, they're often associated with particular roles, qualities. So Aphrodite is the goddess of love and sexuality. Zeus is the kind of king of the gods, etc. So they have their roles. They also come with a kind of story that sees different periods of divine development and ends up with the Olympian gods as the kind of final set of gods. Now, that doesn't mean that other gods aren't still part of this very busy divine world for the ancient Greeks. They have many chthonic gods, which I have to say I think is a pretty good word. It comes from the Greek word chthon, which means land or earth. So they're gods of the earth, sometimes including gods of the underworld. They have various nature gods. So you might have heard of naiads and dryads, who are usually female spirits of trees, water sources, the sea, etc. And then there are also not really named spirits and daimones in the plural. Those are divine spirits that affect people's lives. And even this list isn't a full list. So the Greek religious world is a busy world. It's a world with many gods, with competing spheres of influence, with their own stories, with different ways that they can interact with the humans who may or may not worship them. And a crucial area to think about is ritual and myth. And if we are trying to engage and think about Greek religion, these two concepts are going to be really important ones. So let's have a little think about what they are. First of all, what is myth? I mean, I'm sure you all know the answer to that. I'm sure you can all think of several myths. And indeed, the picture at the lower picture of the two that are on your screen at the moment, that's a very famous myth. That is the myth connected to Athene giving the gift of the olive tree to Athens, which, as the Athenians judge whether that's a better gift or Poseidon's gift of a saltwater spring, the fact that they judge in her favor and judge that the olive tree is their most important gift is why Athens becomes called Athens, and why Athene is the special patroness deity for the city of Athens. So you can no doubt think of many myths that you've come across. Greek myths are still something that many of us know, that many of us have been read as children, and that imbue our consciousness and our way of thinking about the world. They are a source of much of what we understand about Greek religion. Also, for that matter, in a slightly wider way, about ways that Greeks thought about their world, ways that they thought about concepts, about moral values. Crucially, though, they are not fixed. I told you a few details of that story about Athene giving the olive tree. It would be possible to tell that story in different ways. There would perhaps be some fixed points that need to happen. So it has to contain Athene giving the gift or offering the gift of the olive tree, and Poseidon offering a competing gift. It has to include the Athenians' choice, both for the gift and for the goddess. But other parts of the story, retellings of that myth, can include different elements. And that's a really important part of myth, and something that I think is very important about it. Myths are stories that tell us something about the world, particularly the divine world, which contain some fixed points that can't be changed and have to stay the same, but also contain an enormous amount of narrative fluidity. So they're stories that you can tell in different ways. What, however, is ritual? So rituals are sets of actions and behaviors which are done in a particular way that gives them meaning. We usually use the term to mean in a religious context, although it doesn't have to be that. We can talk about ritual in other areas. So rituals are, for the ancient Greeks, a key way in which they engaged with the divine world and thought about the boundary between the mortal world and the divine world. Ritual actions were ways of trying to create some sort of connection between those two, some sort of transference between those two worlds. Their emphasis is on stability, on doing the same thing in the same way. So we might think, for instance, of the ritual of sacrifice. Animal sacrifice is something that, for modern thinkers, is quite difficult to think about in relation to religious practice. But the killing of an animal, the allowing its blood to fall on the altar, the burning certain parts for the gods, feasting on the other parts in a communal way, those are all crucial parts of an important religious ritual that happens many times and for many occasions in Athens and more widely in the Greek world. So important there is that certain things have to happen. No word of ill omen, no bad words ought to be spoken. So there's always a call at the beginning of a sacrificial ritual that tells everybody to speak well, which effectively means shut up, because the danger of somebody saying a wrong word or saying a word at the wrong moment and therefore kind of jinxing, to use a rather modern term, sort of jinxing the ritual, is so great that the request to speak well, euphemeter, it would be in Greek, comes to be a request just to keep your mouth closed in case you accidentally say something that doesn't fit. Different animals might be sacrificed depending on the occasion, depending on the god that's being sacrificed to. But things such as the blood falling on the altar, certain other rituals, and the cutting up of the animal have to follow a recognized procedure. So ritual in many ways is about creating stability. It's hoping that there can be some active communication between a mortal world and between a divine world that is peopled by many, many gods, is hard to predict, can be fickle and difficult and unpredictable for mortals. This repeated action of ritual is trying to establish some degree of stability in the interface between the mortal world and the divine world. Okay, so I've said a little bit about myth. I've said a little bit about ritual. How do they intersect? So myths and rituals often seem very integrally bound up. And I would say that relationship is a kind of two-way one. So sometimes a myth might grow up to explain a ritual. So there might be rituals that happen in certain ways that people have perhaps lost an explanation for. So then a myth grows up to explain why we do it in the way that we do it. Alternatively, the myth might exist first and be a story, and then ritual, a fixing of certain actions in relation to that, might grow out of that to commemorate and to kind of try and stabilize the story that's part of the myth. So it's a very, how can I put it, sort of productive and connective relationship between myth and ritual. And that's going to be somewhat in the background of things that I'm going to be talking about. So a lot of what I'm going to be speaking about today is going to be about religious festivals. Think about religious festivals you've taken part in. Perhaps you might think that you haven't really taken part in many religious rituals, but we pretty much all do through experiencing Christmas, even if we don't feel connected to that on a particularly religious level, or we're not Christian or belong to a different tradition. We're kind of aware of it happening if you live in the UK or in many countries throughout the world. So, just give yourself a second or two to think about what the idea of a religious festival means to you. One of the things that's really important about religious festivals is that they mark something as separate. They mark something as not being part of the everyday pattern of life. So I've kind of fixed on 3 areas that I think are worth thinking about. So festivals are connected to sacred space. So they are things that occur within specific spaces, perhaps spaces that are always given over to festivals. There's a picture of a temple there. Or perhaps places that might also be used in ordinary life, but are used in a special way, are marked as special in order to carry out a festival there. So there might be a procession, for instance, through the streets of the city in Athens, a street that would normally be used in just an everyday way, people going to do their shopping or going to visit friends or whatever. But during the time of a religious festival, that street becomes part of sacred space. Festivals also mark a particular time. They mark sacred time that is set away from the normal activities of the everyday. So up to a point, I mean, presumably all normal life can't have been suspended. People still need to eat and drink and go to the loo and things like that. Up to a point, the time of festivals is marked off as being different to normal time. And then I've also put as my third example, or third area, excuse me, sacred action. So certain behaviors, certain patterns of action are associated with the festival, and in order for it to be a festival, those actions need to be carried out in particular ways. So we might think a little bit as a way of connecting those things, thinking about the sacred space of temples. We can think of it there as being kind of clearly marked. I mean, we might think of the way that the temple is built as being about marking that space as really special. You can't see right inside that temple because there would be an inner shrine within it that is hidden from the outside view, but people would be able to enter. They're often decorated. I'm sure you've seen pictures of statuary and painted decoration, so they're marked out as special. So we could think about temples and temple space. We could also think about things such as processions. Many of the religious festivals in Athens include processions from one part of space to another part of space. We could think of that either as sacred time, because the time spent in the procession is marked off as sacred to the festival, but we could also think of them in terms of sacred action, that taking part in the procession is part of doing something for a god and honouring the god. Okay. Now I'm going to talk for a little bit about the Homeric Hymn to Demeter, because I believe that's something that some of you might be studying, and it's also a good way of thinking about these kind of religious ideas that I've been introducing. Okay, so just to give kind of like a really quick run through of this story, in case for people who haven't come across it or people who would value a reminder. Okay, so the Homeric hymns are texts that were written probably at some point in the 7th or 8th century BC. We don't really know who wrote them. They're sometimes attributed, well, as you can see, they're called Homeric hymns. They're often put in textbooks they're often put in texts with works by another author called Hesiod, who wrote a lot about the gods. So they don't have a kind of fixed authorship in the same way that many other texts do. We have a series of them that are addressed to a variety of gods, and they're a really important source of religious information that's very valuable to us. So how does the story for the Homeric hymn to Demeter go? It starts off with Demeter's daughter, who's called Persephone, and her friends picking flowers in a meadow. It would seem to be springtime at that point. They're picking flowers, they're playing together as young women, and then suddenly Hades, who's the god of the underworld, rides up in his chariot and snatches away Persephone. He's had permission to do this from Persephone's father, who is Zeus. Persephone cries out in fear as she is carried away, and this abduction is seen by Helios, who's one of the gods of the sun. And eventually, Persephone's mother, Demeter, also hears the cries. So she hears the shout from her daughter, but she doesn't know where it comes from. She doesn't know what has happened. She's very upset, and she sets off in search of her daughter. So part of the poem and part of the important story to do with Demeter is about Demeter's search for her lost daughter. And she ends up in a small town called Eleusis, which is not so far away from Athens. And she comes to the house of a king, I think he's the king, who's called Calais. Outside the house, she first of all meets his daughters, who, appropriately for Greek custom, are very respectful and welcoming to this stranger who has arrived in their courtyard. And they speak to her kindly and ask her to wait and say that they will go in and tell their mother. And Demeter who's disguised, of course, as a mortal, has said that she would like to work in the house and that she'd like to be received in it and to work for them. So they go and speak to their mother, who's called Metaneira, and then Demeter, disguised as a mortal woman, is taken into the halls. She's very upset, but one of the other serving women, a woman called Iambe, tells her various jokes and says fairly funny things, which kind of cheers her up a little bit. And Metaneira, the queen, receives her very graciously as well, and it is agreed that she will help to look after Demophoon, who is Metaneira's son. So Demeter, disguised as a mortal, proceeds to do this. But she's not just an ordinary nurse, as you might imagine, given that she is actually a powerful goddess. She also tries to transmit a little bit of the special power, even the beginnings of immortality, to the young baby that she's looking after, so to Demophoon. And he grows up, surprisingly beautifully and surprisingly strongly. And this is because Demeter has been putting him in a sacred fire in order to give him these special qualities. It appears to be part of a process that, were she to be able to complete it, would lead to making Demophoon immortal. However, she's caught in the middle of one of these episodes, and kind of understandably, I feel, Metaneira is not exactly chuffed by the sight of the nurse putting the baby in the fire, and is quite shocked and questions her about it. Demeter is offended at being questioned. I think it's at this point, maybe it's marginally later, but at this point she kind of turns back into her goddess form and is kind of suddenly scary, and Metanera's knees loosen. She kind of falls to her knees because she realizes that she's just been speaking rather harshly to a divine being. And Demeter tells them that if Metanera hadn't interrupted the process, that Demophoon could have been given immortality, but that's not to be. Demeter then speaks to Calais, the king of the palace, and also to some of the Elusinian nobles, and gives instructions to them about how to propitiate her. Propitiate means to kind of appease or stop her feeling angry. So her anger at being doubted by Metanera needs to be appeased, both in the way that they behave towards her, but then also she gives them instructions about about rituals that they need to perform. Despite that, despite these rituals that they perform, Demeter, of course, is still sad about the main thing that she's sad about, which is the fact that she's lost Persephone. And in her sadness, she causes or emerges from her a really difficult situation for the earth, because she's the goddess of the earth's fertility, the earth's crop fertility. And so while she's very unhappy, the crops can't grow. So in this situation, one of the gods goes to Zeus and appeals to him, and he sends Iris, one of the messenger gods, a messenger goddess, a female messenger god, to Demeter to tell her what's going on. And Demeter persuades Zeus to allow Persephone to come back to the upper world, so to come back up from the underworld. They're reunited, and very joyfully reunited. However, Persephone explains to her mother that while in Hades, she was kind of tricked into, and it's not entirely clear how she was tricked into eating a pomegranate seed. And because she has eaten something in the underworld, she is not able to leave the underworld entirely. But a deal is kind of brokered by Zeus with Hades that Persephone will remain in the underworld for some parts of the year, but be returned to the upper world and her mother for other parts of the year. And I believe that round scene at the top is Hades getting Persephone to eat a pomegranate seed. I think you can see in the female figure's hand a little white thing, which is the pomegranate seed. And the lower picture is a moment when I think that's Hades' chariot, and maybe that's Hades out of his chariot about to snatch Persephone. And I think the picture that my face is obscuring is also Demeter and Persephone, but we won't worry about that. Okay. So part of the story that I mentioned was about Demeter giving instructions to Calais and to the Elusinian nobles about setting up a festival in her honor, about certain rituals that need to happen. And this is the foundational story for something called the Elusinian Mysteries. That's the story is in the Homeric Hymn. The Elusinian Mysteries appear to celebrate Persephone's return and Demeter's joy in response to that. They celebrate this agreement and the kind of balance of the idea that that Persephone will live partly in the underworld and partly in the upper world. From inscriptional evidence we've got, sometimes they refer to the goddesses, which people assume means Demeter and Persephone. Persephone is sometimes given her name, Persephone, sometimes called Kore, K-O-R-E, which means maiden, sometimes called Despoina, which means mistress. That's there in the bottom bullet point, Despoina. People seem to think that's Persephone rather than Demeter, who's referred to as Despoina. And just as a little aside, if you go to Greece, if you have any Greek friends, Despina is quite a common name in Greece even now, meaning mistress. So the god and the goddess, that reference is possibly to Persephone and Pluto, or Persephone and Hades. Hades and Pluto are the same person. Poseidon might be included in that list. And there's also a god called Triptolemus, who appears to be an agricultural god, who is also sometimes worshipped in the Elusinian Mysteries. What do the Elusinian Mysteries entail? Well, they include a procession from Athens to Eleusis. Now, unfortunately, I've got a map. Can I move? Can people see that there's a, I've tried to move our faces. I don't know if you can see the map now.
Yeah, I'm not sure because mine is off to the side, so I can see the map. So hopefully other people can too.
Okay, cool. What I wanted to show with the map is how far Athens and Eleusis are from each other. So Athens is well, you can see where it is, and then there's Eleusis, maybe slightly covered by something at the top. I guess it's maybe about 20 miles, perhaps. So a procession along a route, obviously very public, very big, very important. Some people have linked it to kind of political and territorial issues. Eleusis is quite close to the boundary of land that counts as Attica, counts as the area of land that Athens is central to and Athens is in charge of. Some people think that having the procession going from the centre to the outside for this festival, from the centre to a different outside for a different festival, is a way of marking Athens's territory. Because if you have a festival in an outlying part of your territory, you're showing that territory belongs to you. So some people have linked it to political and territorial ideas. Now, as you'll have noticed from the name, the Elusinian rituals are mysteries. So we don't know that much about them. There are secret rites, which are called arrhetera. Now, within the middle of that word, the R-H-E-T bit, like rhetoric, is to do with speaking. Arrhetera means unspeakable things. And this meant that people weren't allowed to talk about them. If you had been initiated by going to the Elusinian Mysteries, then you were forbidden to speak of it. And we even have some legal speeches from people who've been prosecuted for blasphemy for speaking too openly about such secrets. And if you're not allowed to speak about it, then you're not allowed to write it down either. So a lot of these rituals remain very shadowy and uncertain. It would seem that there's some ritual pouring to the east and to the west, might represent the sky and the earth, might represent conception in some ways, because in some myths, and in fact in even older Indo-European myths, the rain falling upon the ground is thought of as being a reflection of, is thought of as being original act of sexual conception. So the pouring of it might have some significance of that. There seems to be a careful cutting of an ear of corn. And if we think of an ear of corn quite small, you would have to cut it very carefully. There seems to be some idea of immortality. Now, I'm sure you will have be used to the idea that ancient Greek, and for that matter Roman, religious systems did not really promise an afterlife, not in the way that many modern religions or many Abrahamic religions propose an idea of some form of life after death. And that is certainly true. Ancient Greek pagan religion does not propose any kind of meaning, that's not the right word. It doesn't assume a life after death for anybody in that way. However, the rituals of the Elusinian Mysteries would seem to be in some ways connected to having some form of existence post-death. And we can assume that this associates with Persephone's role in the underworld as Queen of the Dead, that perhaps her role there and having some sort of better life within the underworld is connected to it. There would also appear to be some rituals associated with showing and viewing. Epopteia is the word for this type of ritual viewing. Nobody really knows what that is. Some people think it might be to do with something to do with a child and with conception. Some people think it might be to do with some sort of special secret about agricultural fertility because of Demeter's association with that. But frankly, no one really knows, which is, well, I think it's kind of quite cool that it's still, it's still a secret thousands of years later. There's evidence that shows that the Elusinian Mysteries or some form of ritual for Demeter being celebrated at Eleusis goes way back beyond the kind of normal period of Greek history that we often study, right back into what's called the Mycenaean period, which will be taking us back into kind of 1400 BC. So it's a very old rite. It's also, if you look at the very bottom bullet point, Pan-Hellenic. Now, Pan-Hellenic, pan means all, Hellenic means to do with Greece. So Pan-Hellenic means it's for all Greece. So, as I said at the beginning, there might be some crucial sort of political and territorial element of it, and it's centered by Athens. Athens pay for it, Athens organize it. But it's also a ritual that people from all over Greece would be welcome to come to. It's celebrating one of the big gods of the Olympian gods, Demeter. So it's also a moment where Athens might feel itself on display, where it welcomes visitors and people coming to see how amazing their ritual is. Okay. I'm just going to pause there. I'm sorry this slide is a bit of a mess. Anyway, there is kind of a point to it. Okay, so I was talking about the Elusinian Mysteries, and they're really important to do with Demeter. They would seem to have some central role for corn and some ideas of agricultural fertility, which Demeter is obviously deeply associated with. However, and I'm sorry to break this to you, they're not in the spring. So the Elusinian Mysteries are sometime in the kind of very late summer, really in the autumn. So while they're to do with agricultural fertility, etc., couldn't really say they were to do with the spring. So instead, I have sort of shifted my focus to thinking about the spring. And I have focused on the first, well, not for the Greeks, the first 3 months, because their year started in the middle of the summer, but for the months that we might associate with the spring. So roughly between January and April. And I've been looking at the 3 first months of the 3 months in that period of the Attic calendar, one called Gamilian, which stretches roughly between, if we think of our calendar, the Gregorian calendar, roughly corresponds to kind of January, February, a month called Anthesterion, which roughly corresponds to February and March, and a month called Elaphebolion, which roughly stretches or corresponds to March and April. And my pictures there, sorry, a bit of a mess. So there's a nice springy picture with lots of flowers. There's a picture that is hidden, or at least it's hidden for me. I'll have to move myself. Oh yeah, there's a picture that I think is to do with the, I think that's the chariot of the sun drawing. Oh no, the chariot of the sun is the one down here, sorry. So I was trying to get over the idea that the Attic calendar of months is on a mixture of a lunar and a solar system. So the months are kind of lunar months, but then because lunar months don't kind of fit neatly in a year, if you're wanting to have 12 of them, they also then have to have a sort of rebalancing element to keep them in line with the solar year. And my picture here, the one with the 2 pots, that was just a kind of random afterthought. What that is a water clock that would be used in various political and particularly legal scenarios to measure time in a very fixed way. And so I was kind of quite interested in the idea that many of the time patterns of the Athenian year were on a fairly fluid lunar solar basis. You might have to stick in a few extra days to kind of make the lunar calendar and the solar calendar line up. And actually it's very unusual within the ancient conceptions of time to have very fixed ideas of time, which is measured by the water clock, but only in extremely specific circumstances. Okay, I'll move on. I was trying to sort of think about time and calendars and whatever, and so think about springtime as a period in the year. Okay, so what if we think about, if we kind of add these things together and think about festivals in the springtime? Now, there are festivals throughout the entirety of the time in Athens. In fact, the first few days of every month, of every lunar month, were sacred to particular gods. So the beginning of each month would start with, I think it's maybe 4 or 5 days worth of days that were sacred to, I think one of them is, maybe the first one is always Athena, and then the next one is always another god. So each kind of, every kind of 28 days, it'd be punctuated by this kind of little chunk of festivals. There are also many, many festivals dotted throughout the year, and individuals and different groups of people would probably have their own festivals and rituals to celebrate. But then there are some rather bigger ones, and that I thought I would look at briefly at these bigger festivals that happen in the period between January and April. So in the month of Gamilian, there's the Lanaya, there's the Gamilia. In the month of Anthesterion, there's the Anthesteria, and in the month of Elaphebolion, there's the city Dionysia. So I'm going to do just a whistle-stop tour through those because I don't think I've got very long anyway. I'm actually going to jump on because I'll go back, but I put these in the wrong order. So the first of the ones that I particularly spoke about there is one called the Lanaya, which is celebrated in the month of Gamilian, so in the January-February month, and is a 4-day festival, which happens fairly early in the month. It is in honor of the god Dionysus. He is one of the Olympian gods, often treated as if he is the kind of latest or the kind of youngest of the Olympian gods. I'm sure you have come across him as the god of wine, the god of and the god of theatre. Those are two very important elements of his divine persona. He's also the god of certain types of fertility. Now, people think that the Lanaya is in honor of Dionysus in his role as Dionysus Linnaeus, and that means of the wine press. So it's associated with his role in the kind of production of wine. It was a very noisy festival. There were processions with noise and cymbals and girls clacking castanets. There was sacrifice and feasting, which always go together, and there were theatrical performances, especially comedy. So including in our texts, in texts of Aristophanic comedy, we have it referred to the fact that the typical time for the production of comedies was at the Lanaya festival earlier in the year, when Athens wasn't so full of tourists, wasn't so full of visitors. And they're all organized by one of the chief officials in Athens, who is elected each year, called the Archon Basileus, which roughly translates as the King Archon. Okay, so first big festival is the Lanaya, which is for Dionysus, is theatrical, is celebrating the production of wine. The next one, going backwards because I put them the wrong way, but try and forgive me for that, is called the Gamilia. Again, like many of these situations, we don't know lots of details. Gamilion is often treated as the month of marriages. This would seem to, so the Gamilia festival, which is I think just one day, probably the 26th of Gamilian, so towards the end of the month of Gamilian, celebrates the sacred marriage of Zeus and Hera. There are food and drink offerings. It may well celebrate new beginnings. It focuses on marriage and focuses on a ritual where the husband honors his marriage and makes it public to his phratry. Now, a phratry is kind of like biggish kin group that also holds records, like kind of records of birth and marriage and things like that. So it's also a way of making marriages kind of official in some ways. Possibly through that, it became connected to citizenship and almost like a proof of marriage, although that role might have been at the Aperturia, which is 9 months later. And I'm sure we can all guess what they think might have happened 9 months later on after marriage. So it would seem to fuse between commemorating a particular divine moment, having a kind of personal element of the kind of celebration of the concept of marriage, and where a husband would honor the idea of marriage, but then also potentially has a civic dimension where it ends up working as kind of part of the rituals that kind of cement rights to citizenship and the political element of marriage. Okay, and then we go into the month of Anthesterion and have the festival Anthesteria, which really means the flower festival, and is connected with new shoots and the new growth of plants. This is also for Dionysus. It would seem that it's a festival that particularly allows, maybe even to a certain extent, is focused somewhat on children. There are 3 days. The first day is called Pythoigia, the second day is called Coes, and the third day is called Kritroi. So the first day is called Pythoigia and is the opening of the Pythoi. Now, my picture at the bottom right hand, the big brownie jar, is a pythos. A pythos is a really huge, I mean, some of the biggest ones would be maybe not quite as tall as me, but would certainly come up to my waist, or even maybe to my chest. These are huge storage jars, and they were what wine would have been stored in from when it was made after the harvest in sort of October, November time, and then it's stored, I guess, pressed at some point, and then the jars are opened and there's the first tasting ceremony at the Anthesteria. So the first day of the festival is called Pythoigia and is the opening of the Pythoi. The second day is called Coes and is connected with pouring ceremonies. And I've given you 2 vases, which are both, they're sometimes called oinokoi, they're special wine pouring. So oinos means wine, koi is the word that means pouring. So they're connected to pouring. And you get a lot of these, there are actually quite a lot in museums in the UK, including sometimes some little tiny ones, which were for children. So children were also offered a little bit of wine. And there seemed to be processions and merrymaking, but also drinking competitions, which are done in silence. Seems a little bit of a weird idea to me. There were some state rituals and also some commemoration of sacred marriage as well. And then on the third day, called Kitroi, I think I've misspelled it, I don't think you should have the first R in it. And that refers to the pots, and would seem to be also, interestingly, a festival of kind of the Day of the Dead. So I think that potentially they would have little, just as they have children having their own little pouring pots and their own little drinking pots, they would leave them out for dead people who were not physically present, but were still part of this communal connection of doing stuff together, performing ritual together. So as part of the Anthesterion, they would commemorate that by leaving cups for the dead. So it's interesting as a ritual that's celebrating Dionysus, wine, Dionysus's element of fertility, new beginnings, children, and the dead. Perhaps the dead being still with us and still part of a continuing family that is continuing through with children from generation to generation. And then finally, again, I'm just going to speak very briefly about this because, you know, we could do entire talks about the city Dionysia. This is in the month of Elaphebolion, and it's probably the most elaborate in fact, probably the most elaborate of the entire festival year. It's a 5-day festival. It is also for Dionysus, It's very famous, very public, is absolutely expected to draw people into Athens. It's Athens showcasing itself and its way of celebrating to the outside Greek world. There are many civic rites. We learn a little bit later, probably into the 4th century, that there would be the generals would pour libations, the tribute that was given to Athens from other city-states wanting Athens to protect them was paraded through the theatre of Dionysus. So it has huge civic significance. I often say, think about the rituals that open something like the Olympic Games, the way that the host country is saying something about itself in those rituals that open a big celebration. Lots of processions and feasting. The statue of Dionysus is taken from the center of Athens out somewhere to the edge and brought back in. Then the statue is laid on a couch so that it can join in the feasting. Okay, so the statue is there as if it's present at the feast, and then the statue is carried into the theatre of Dionysus for one of the very main bits of the whole celebration, which is putting on theatrical performances, particularly tragedies and satyr plays. Okay, so I've run through those 4 main festivals that happen in what for us would be the opening months of the year. Not really for the Athenians, because as I said, their year runs from midsummer to midsummer. And I'm going to move on to final thoughts here. One of the things that really struck me when I was doing this, I think I came to it thinking, oh, Demeter and Persephone, oh, new life, oh, Demeter being upset and not allowing new things to grow not allowing new things to grow. And I came into it expecting there to be a lot of that focused around the spring, a lot of very agriculturally focused rituals in that period of the year. And I didn't find it. What I did find was Dionysus. Dionysus, it's true, is a god that's very important for Athens and for the Athenian state. New beginnings, some sense of Dionysus's connection to fertility is there somewhere. Wine is importantly there, and of course that's a very important agricultural product. I do think there are new beginnings celebrated in these festivals that happen in the springtime, but there's also a lot of thought about the underworld and the dead. I think I would also say that for me, themes that come out of those rituals that take part in that time of year were themes of community and time. So where occasions that people can act together, both in terms of rituals, but also in terms of sitting together and watching the same thing in theatrical performance or feasting together as part of a religious festival. So the kind of enacting what community means to us seems to be, I'm sure it's very important at other times of the year, but certainly seems to be a very important theme within that period that we would think of as being springtime.